I want to tell you something I have never said out loud to anyone except one person. And that person is the reason I am sitting here tonight trying to find the right words for something that does not have any right words. This is not a love story. At least, it did not start as one. It started as the worst week of my life. And somewhere inside that week, in a place I was not looking and was not ready for, something found me anyway. I have spent 2 years trying to figure out whether that makes me lucky or guilty. I still do not have a clean answer. But I have an honest one. And honest is all I know how to be at this hour. My name does not matter. What matters is that I was 38 years old. I thought I knew exactly what my life looked like, and then a Tuesday morning in October reminded me that life does not ask your permission before it rearranges everything. I had been with Sandra for 9 years. We were not married, which people always found surprising when they found out how long we had been together. We had talked about it twice, briefly, the way you talk about renovating a kitchen, something you both agree sounds good in theory but never quite schedule. We lived together in a 2-bedroom apartment in Austin, Texas. She had the second bedroom converted into a studio because she painted. Not professionally, not for money, just because she said her hands needed something to do that her brain could not interfere with. I used to stand in the doorway sometimes and watch her without her knowing, and I think those were some of the quietest, most complete moments of my life. She was 36. She ran 5 miles every Saturday morning regardless of weather. She made terrible coffee and refused to acknowledge it. She cried at nature documentaries but never at movies. She was the most specific person I had ever known, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. On a Tuesday morning in October, Sandra went to her routine checkup and did not come home with the news we expected. She came home with a diagnosis that changed the architecture of everything. I will not use the name of what she had. It does not belong in this story as a word. What belongs here is what it meant, that the woman I had built a quiet life with was suddenly fighting for the right to keep living it. The next 14 months were the longest of my life. And also, in ways I am still ashamed to admit, some of the most intimate. You learn things about a person when the ordinary scaffolding of daily life falls away and all that is left is the essential question of who they are. Sandra was braver than I had words for. She was also angrier, and more afraid, and more darkly funny than I had ever seen her, and I loved every version of her that those 14 months produced. But loving someone through something like that takes everything you have. And when it is over, regardless of how it ends, you are not the same person who started. Sandra died on a December morning, 11 days before Christmas. She was 37 years old. I was 38, standing in a hospital corridor holding a paper cup of cold coffee, and I remember thinking, I do not know how to do any of this without her. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something. Have you ever lost someone and felt, in the middle of all that grief, something you were not supposed to feel? Something that confused you. Something that made you question what kind of person you were for feeling it at all. If you have, I want you to drop it in the comments right now. Not the details. Just, yes. Just let me know I am not the only one who has sat with something like this. Also, I love knowing where my viewers are connecting from. Kindly drop your location in the comment section. And if this story is already doing something to you, hit that like button before you forget. Subscribe to this channel because what I am about to tell you next is the part that took me 2 years to be able to say. And I promise you, it is worth staying for. Still with me? Good. Keep watching. Sandra's funeral was held on a Friday. Gray sky, cold enough to see your breath, the kind of December day that feels like the world is agreeing with you about how bad things are. There were about 90 people there. Sandra had that kind of reach. She was the person who remembered your birthday without being reminded and showed up to things other people forgot they had said yes to. People loved her in that specific, dependable way you love someone who makes you feel like you are seen. I stood at the front and said the words I had written at 2 in the morning on a yellow legal pad, and I do not remember a single one of them now. I remember the yellow pad. I remember the pen running out halfway through and having to find another one. I remember thinking, this is what grief does to time. It makes the small things enormous and the enormous things impossible to hold. After the service, there was food at Sandra's parents' house. Her mother, Patrice, had insisted on hosting. That was how Patrice processed things. She fed people. She made enough food for twice the number of guests and spent the entire afternoon refilling plates and hugging people and somehow managing to be the strongest person in a room full of people who were supposed to be comforting her. I had known Patrice for 9 years. She had never fully warmed to me in the beginning, the way some mothers hold back their full approval until they are certain you have earned it. But somewhere in the middle of Sandra's illness, something shifted between us. We had sat together in too many waiting rooms. We had traded too many looks across too many hospital beds. By the time December came, Patrice and I were something I did not have a clean word for. Not family, exactly. But not strangers either. Something that had been forged in a place neither of us had chosen to be. I was sitting alone in Sandra's parents' kitchen about 2 hours into the reception, holding a plate of food I had not touched, when someone sat down across from me. I looked up. I did not recognize her at first. Not because she was unfamiliar, but because grief has a way of making your brain process slowly, like a phone running too many things at once. Then it landed. Diane. Sandra's younger sister. I had met her exactly 4 times in 9 years. She lived in Portland. She and Sandra had the complicated, layered relationship that sisters who are very different sometimes have, deep love expressed mostly through tension and phone calls that lasted longer than either of them planned. She looked like Sandra in the way that a song covered by a different artist sounds like the original, familiar in structure, different in every detail that matters. Same dark eyes. Different energy behind them. Where Sandra had been still, Diane was watchful. Where Sandra had been certain, Diane seemed like someone who had learned to hold her conclusions loosely. She sat down across from me with a glass of water and no food and said, "You are the one who stayed." Not a question. A statement. I did not know what to do with it. So I just said, for as long as she needed me to. Diane looked at me for a moment. Then she looked down at her glass. "She told me about you. More than you probably know." I did not say anything to that. I was not sure what version of me Sandra had described, and I was not sure I was ready to find out at a funeral reception in my girlfriend's parents' kitchen while holding a plate of untouched casserole. We sat in silence for a while. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that happens when two people are both too tired to perform okayness and have silently agreed to stop trying. Outside the kitchen window, I could see a few guests standing in the backyard despite the cold, talking in the way people talk at funerals, quietly, seriously, with their hands wrapped around warm cups. The sky had gone from gray to a darker gray. It was going to snow before the night was over. "Did you eat anything today?" Diane asked. "Technically," I said. She reached across the table and pulled my plate toward her, looked at it, and then got up without saying anything. She came back 2 minutes later with a different plate. Something warm. Something that had clearly just come out of the oven. "Patrice made the good stuff for the back of the buffet," she said. "You have to know where to look." I ate. She watched the backyard. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, and it was the most human I had felt all day. Diane flew back to Portland 3 days later. I did not expect to hear from her again. We had exchanged numbers in the driveway at the end of the reception, the way people do at funerals when they mean well but understand that the geography of grief tends to pull people back into their separate lives. She texted me 9 days later. "Just checking you are still eating actual meals." I stared at that message for longer than I should have. Then I typed back, "Define actual." She sent back a single laughing emoji and then, "That is a no. I will check again in a week." She did. And the week after that. And the week after that. It was never a long conversation. She never pushed for more than I offered. She had a particular skill for asking one question and then leaving space for however much or little I wanted to fill it with. It reminded me of the way a good interviewer works, present without pressure. I asked her once, about a month in, why she kept checking in. She thought about it for a moment before she replied. Then, because Sandra would have wanted someone to. And because I am not sure anyone else is. That landed somewhere deep and stayed there. She was right, as it turned out. The people who had surrounded me in December had, by February, largely returned to their own lives. Not out of cruelty. Just out of the natural way that time moves people forward whether they are ready or not. The condolence messages had tapered. The check-in calls had spaced out. The world had moved on in the gentle, indifferent way that the world always does. Diane had not. By March we were talking on the phone. Not texting. Talking. The first time it happened it was because I had sent a voice message by accident instead of a text, and she called back laughing and said she preferred it, and somehow we ended up on the phone for an hour and 40 minutes talking about Sandra, about loss, about what it means to keep living inside a life that has been structurally altered. Diane had her own grief. Sandra had been her sister. The complicated love between them had left its own particular shape of absence, different from mine but no less real. She talked about it honestly, without performing it, and I found that more comforting than anything anyone had said to me since December. I want to be clear about something. I was not looking for this. I was not lonely in the way that goes searching. I was lonely in the way that sits very still and does not know what to do with itself. There is a difference, and it matters. What was happening between Diane and me was not romantic in those months. It was something else. Something harder to name. The particular closeness that forms between two people who are grieving the same person from different angles and have somehow found that talking to each other makes the weight slightly more bearable. But I would be lying if I said I did not notice the moment it started to become something else. It was a Sunday evening in April. I was on the phone with Diane and we had been talking for almost 2 hours and had somehow moved from talking about Sandra to talking about our own lives, our own histories, the things we had wanted before life arranged itself the way it had. She told me she had almost moved to Austin 7 years ago. There had been a job offer, a good one. She had turned it down for a relationship that did not survive the following year anyway. You would have met Sandra sooner, I said. I know, she said. Then quietly, I might have met you sooner too. There was a pause after that. Not awkward. Something else. The kind of pause that happens when something true has been said and both people need a moment to let it settle before they decide what to do with it. Neither of us did anything with it that night. We talked for another 20 minutes about something else entirely and then said good night. But after I hung up I sat in my kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. I want to tell you exactly what I felt, because this is a confession and confessions only work if they are precise. I felt guilty. Immediately and thoroughly guilty. Sandra had been gone for 4 months. She was the reason Diane and I had any connection at all. The idea that something was forming between me and her sister felt like a betrayal of a person who was no longer there to be betrayed, which made it somehow worse. I also felt something else. Something I did not want to name because naming it would make it real. I felt less alone than I had since December. And that terrified me more than the guilt did. I did not call Diane for 2 weeks. Not because I was angry, not because anything had gone wrong, but because I needed to sit with what I was feeling long enough to understand it before I did anything that could not be undone. I talked to exactly one person about it. My older brother, Cal. He is not a man of many words and his advice is not always gentle, but it is always honest, which is what I needed. I told him everything. The calls, the months of checking in, the Sunday evening, the pause, what I had felt afterward. He listened without interrupting, which is not typical for Cal. When I finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is she a good person?" "Yes," I said. Without hesitation. "Did she go looking for this?" "No." "Did you?" "No." Another pause. Then what exactly are you punishing yourself for?" I did not have a clean answer for that. I told him I felt like it was too soon. Like the timing made it wrong regardless of what it was. "Timing is real," he said. "But it is not the same thing as wrong." He said one more thing before we hung up. He said, "Sandra spent 9 years with a man who showed up. I do not think she would spend 5 minutes wanting that man to disappear into guilt for the rest of his life. Do you?" I thought about that for a long time. The honest answer was no. The Sandra I had known for 9 years, the woman who cried at nature documentaries and made terrible coffee and painted with her hands to quiet her brain, was not a person who would have wanted her loss to become a cage for the people she loved. But knowing that and feeling free from the weight of it are two very different things. I called her on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after that Sunday. She answered on the second ring and said nothing for a moment, just, "Hi." "Hi," I said. "I figured you needed some time," she said. "You knew?" "I am Sandra's sister," she said simply. I know what that pause meant. I have been sitting with it too. We talked for 3 hours that night. Honestly, directly, without performing anything. She told me she had not expected this. That when she started checking in after the funeral, she genuinely only meant to make sure I was eating and sleeping and functioning like a human being. She had not planned for what the conversations became. She also told me something that I want to share exactly as she said it, because it was the most important thing anyone said to me that year. She said, "I loved my sister. I love her now, present tense, even though she is gone. And part of loving her is knowing who she was. And she was not someone who would want either of us to close ourselves off from something real out of loyalty to her memory. She would have hated that. She would have called it sentimental and self-indulgent and then made us both feel slightly ridiculous for it." I laughed. Because she was right. That was exactly what Sandra would have said. It was the first time I had laughed like that since December. Real and sudden and completely unguarded. And in that laugh I felt something shift inside me that had been locked in place for a long time. Diane and I did not rush anything. That felt important to both of us. She came to Austin in June. We walked around the city for 2 days and talked and ate good food and did not pretend the situation was simple. On the second evening we were sitting on the steps outside a small bookshop that was about to close and she said, "Is this strange for you? Being here with me?" I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said. "But not in the way that means we should not be here." She nodded slowly. "I think there are two kinds of strange. The kind that is telling you to stop. And the kind that is just the feeling of something new." "Which kind is this?" I asked. She looked at me. "You already know the answer to that." I did. "What I want to tell you, and what I need you to understand before this story ends, is that what exists between Diane and me is not a replacement for what I had with Sandra. It is not a continuation of it either. It is its own thing entirely, with its own weight and its own specific shape. Sandra will always be the first person I built a life with. She will always be the woman who painted with her hands and cried at nature documentaries and made coffee that tasted like a mistake. She will always be the person whose absence taught me what presence actually costs. And Diane will always be the person who showed up in a gray December kitchen with a plate of warm food and did not ask me to be okay when I was not. Both of those things are true at the same time. I have learned that grief does not work like a door that closes behind you. It is more like a room you carry with you. It changes size over time. Some days it is the whole house. Some days it is just a small quiet space you pass through on your way to somewhere else. Diane understands that room because she has her own version of it. We do not pretend otherwise. That, more than anything else, is why it works. It has been almost 2 years since that December. I still have Sandra's last painting hanging in my apartment. A small abstract thing, mostly blues and a burnt orange she mixed herself that I have never seen in any other painting. Diane pointed at it the first time she came to Austin and said, she always loved that orange. She used to say it was the color of the last hour of light before everything goes dark. I had never known that. There are things Diane knows about Sandra that I never will. And there are things I know that Diane never will. Between us, we hold a more complete picture of the same person than either of us could alone. I find that strange and beautiful and a little heartbreaking all at the same time. Which is, I think, exactly how it should feel. I did not go looking for love in the worst week of my life. I went looking for a way to get through the day. And something found me anyway, quietly, patiently, in the form of a woman who brought me warm food at a funeral and checked in 9 days later to make sure I was still eating. I do not know what the years ahead look like. I have learned, the hard way, not to hold the future too tightly. But I know what tonight looks like. Tonight looks like a man who is still grieving and still living and has finally stopped treating those two things like they cannot exist in the same sentence. That is enough. For tonight, that is more than enough. This has been Midnight Confessions. Wherever you are watching from tonight, I am glad you were here for this one.